So today I have a whole bunch of thoughts on something that, I guess it's about cancel culture. And you're like, Jacob, what year do you think this is? This is not a fresh topic. I know, and probably nobody else cares about this, but I started my day, as I often do, scrolling through Reddit, and of course the idea of needing to kind of curate the media that you consume hasn't gone away, because there are a lot of people out there, and I'm one of them. Like, I select the authors whose books I read, and sometimes the movies and media that I consume based on the ethics of the people producing it, right? Or the actions, sometimes the political beliefs. But I really do feel like a lot of people go really overboard on this. But at the same time, I do get it. And this was spurred on this morning from a tweet of somebody saying that, like, they're just about ready to give up reading altogether. Because every time they get into an author, they then find out something heinous about them, right? And it's usually something like a political belief of theirs, maybe something that they've done that kind of runs against their personal worldview. And I kind of get that, but also it kind of also makes the point that, like, if you're expecting ideological purity in everything that you consume, especially if you're just talking about fiction for media, for entertainment, and that's mostly where I'm going to stick with here. Like, nonfiction, it probably matters a little more, right? I'll get to that. But, like, if it's a fiction book, if it's sci-fi or fantasy just for your entertainment, I'm not sure it's worth trying to actually vet authors to that extent. That said, I'm going to start this whole thing out with, a general disclaimer that, like, you shouldn't force yourself to consume something that you don't enjoy. It doesn't really matter why you don't enjoy it. If you can't enjoy it because you know something that just won't get out of your head about the person who produced it, then that's all the reason you need. It's just like, man, I just can't get over this. I have that with Kevin Spacey, right? Back 10 years ago, Kevin Spacey was probably one of my favorite actors. I loved House of Cards, and he's a phenomenal actor, right? But I can't watch any of his movies now without every time I see his face, I think I can't not think Sex Pest. It just pulls me right out of the experience, right? So I've basically quit watching anything that he ever produced, and that sucks because he's an asshole and a terrible person. But it's less about trying to punish him and more about going like, well, I just can't enjoy this now. So, like, in my opinion, that's all the reason you need. Like, the whole point of reading a book or watching a movie for entertainment is for your own personal enjoyment. So I think that's a good general caveat of, like, everybody's going to have the lines that, like, bother them enough that they can't enjoy something anymore, and that's all the reason you need not to. But I do think it's important to ask, why can't you enjoy it, and are you just punishing yourself, right? To some extent, it's gonna vary based on the severity of, or, like, how egregious you think their perceived violation might be, right? To me, somebody like Kevin Spacey, like, he did something bad that hurt people directly. His actions, not necessarily his beliefs or his worldview, but the way he treats people. And, like, I just can't not see him as a predator, right? So that's kind of a personal example. I have others, but, like, I'll just kind of throw that out there. But when we're thinking about, I want to think especially about books, because you don't have to have that same visceral reaction with a book and its author. But I think authors get treated this way a lot more than a whole lot of other media creators. And in my opinion, the ideas that are contained within the story that you're reading matter a lot more than the author themselves. I think there are a lot of great examples of this, and that works both ways. Like, I'm a big fan. I haven't read any of his books in a long time, but I've loved every Chuck Palahniuk book that I've ever read. If you're not familiar, this is Fight Club and Choke and Lullaby and Survivor. Survivor, like, legitimately changed my life, But those books aren't unproblematic. I've read many books that have I've read like samurai philosophy that changed my worldview for the better, and that I recognize is not all good, right? Because I think what matters is whether you take the ideas that are presented to you and whether you accept them uncritically or not, right? Like, so I don't accept everything that's in the Book of the Five Rings or in Hagakure uncritically, because a lot of it is just sexist nonsense, but there is good stuff in there, and I'm glad I read it. Going back to like fiction, I don't know that there's a sort of futility in trying to purity test every author that you read, because Gene Roddenberry was a sexist, man, but Star Trek has some good stuff in it, right? J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings speaks for itself. He's a racist. He was born in 1892. What do you expect, right? Arthur C. Clarke. I own the entire 2001 Space Odyssey series. I don't regret reading it. He was a sex pest, right? That's a little more, like, for me, that's a line that bothers me a little more. But guess what? There's none of that's like in the books. And you can't take away the fact that Arthur C. Clarke basically discovered geostationary orbit. Like, these people are influential because their ideas were good, right? And even like media can be reimagined. I think also sticking to sci-fi here, I think like Starship Troopers was always like a C grade sort of novel and franchise. But Robert Heinlein's original book, like the Starship Troopers that we all know here in the 21st century, is like this brilliant, funny kind of satire of fascism and militarism, and but the book wasn't. The book had those themes. Don't get me wrong. The book was very much an exploration of militarism and fascism, and like the military state. But Robert Heinlein didn't treat it as a satire. He actually like put forth those ideas honestly, and in that sense, like, yeah, I'm not sure I can recommend the book. It's not something that ages well, but the movie reimagined that same content, those same themes into something that was much more useful, I think, right? And the ideas that are explored there become worth exploring again, right? But if you just completely go like, nope, we're not going to touch it, then you never have that opportunity. I'm going to go, and then, I'm going to go right for it. J.K. Rowling, all right? J.K. Rowling is a great example. I don't think there are any authors that are talked about in this context quite as much as J.K. Rowling. And everybody, again, I'm going to go back to my first caveat. If you just can't enjoy it because you can't get this thought out of your head anytime you pop in, you open up one of her books, or you try to watch the movies or something like that for Harry Potter, I get it. That's all the reason you need. If you just can't enjoy it anymore, I get it. However, I do want you to think about this in this context. And a lot of people have written a lot about this because it's a legitimate... Why am I out of focus? My camera will figure it out, or it won't. But anyway, it's a legitimate thing. People have noticed that, like, and it's part of the tragedy with J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter is that Harry Potter is very popular in the queer community because a lot of people read it as, you can read it as a queer trans allegory, right? You have this little boy who, comes to understand something about himself, that he's different from his family, right? And it's a way that his family knows, and they want to suppress that about them, and they don't want him to be different in that way. And that this child has to learn this thing about himself, and he has to then go out into the world and find other people like him and to become more who they already are authentically, despite what his guardians, what his family wants for him, right? And yeah, it's not hard to read that as an allegory for coming out, for being queer, for being trans. Hey, I'm back in focus. Great. But like, if you read those books and you didn't know anything about J.K. Rowling's politics in the here and now, you wouldn't glean any of the hate, right? Nobody did until she opened her mouth, right? If she had never expressed herself or expressed those beliefs, nobody would be any the wiser, because the content of the books themselves doesn't really contain those ideas, right? So I really think that's something that's valuable to key in on, is that the ideas that are presented to you in the novel, in the book itself, or in the movie, or whatever media you want to talk about here, is far more important than the author, right? When you read The Lord of the Rings, yeah, you know what? There's some racial subtext in there. There's some of it's not quite subtext. Some of it's pretty overt, right? But the overall themes are still incredibly valuable, and like I said, what's important is whether you accept the ideas presented to you uncritically, right? I read all kinds of fiction and nonfiction, and sometimes I'll deliberately subject myself to stuff that I don't agree with, and I know I won't. But I read it anyway because oftentimes it's useful to understand those other worldviews, right? But even when you're reading something that you're inclined to agree with, you should be thinking somewhat critically about what you're consuming, because frankly, and here's my overall thesis here, what matters here when you're talking about your media consumption and your media diet is less about that transaction of like, and I understand, voting with your dollars and everything, but like, if I spend $15 on a DVD or a book or something for, from Harry Potter, yeah, I guess in some small measurable way, I'm supporting this person whose politics I disagree with. However, that impact is almost nothing, honestly, right? It doesn't, sure, when hundreds of millions of people do it, yeah, it adds up. But let's be honest, whether you play Hogwarts Legacy or not isn't going to make a single difference to anybody else in the world. Not J.K. Rowling, not the people that she might support or fight against politically. It doesn't make a difference to the trans community if you're $15 poorer and you have a video game that you enjoy, right? What matters is how your overall media diet affects you, how you consume those ideas, whether you take them critically or uncritically, and how they affect your worldview, because your media diet does affect your worldview. God, it does. That's the whole point, right? You should read things that make you a better person. And whether that's, 2001: A Space Odyssey, written by a guy who's a known sex pest but had good ideas, or Gene Roddenberry, who's a misogynist and a sexist, but man, like, the humanism in Star Trek is undeniable, right? So like, there's warts and there's flaws everywhere, and it's up to you to decide what bothers you enough to just say, no, I don't want that in my life. I get it. I think part of this, though, and I'm going to zoom out for a second. Now I'm going to give a practical answer here, and it's going to be somewhat silly in the context, but I'm going to zoom out for a second and think, like, this conversation is very strange, because I think it's reflective of how well trained most people are, or that we are. I mean, I am too, as to think of myself as a consumer first. That like, my main role in society is to consume, is to exchange money for goods or services, or in this case, entertainment. And therefore, since that's my role, that's the thing I need to worry about, is how do I consume ethically, right? I think that's where a lot of this comes from, but that's not activism. That's not, like I said, it doesn't actually change anyone's lives if you buy a Harry Potter book or not, right? So I think it's reflective of how well trained we are to think of ourselves as our main role in society is consumers, and therefore that's the only thing that matters about me. And so I am doing something when I choose to boycott, a certain media franchise, right? And you're not. I'm sorry, but you're not. It doesn't change anyone's lives if you decide to quit reading a certain author, especially after they are already famous and, billionaires in J.K. Rowling's case. it's not activism to deny yourself access to media. It just isn't. It doesn't make you a better or worse person whether you're sending your dollars a certain direction or not, when it's a very small drop in a very large ocean. It impacts almost nobody. What affects people in a real way in your life is how your media diet changes you, how it affects your worldview, and therefore your behavior and how you interact with and relate to other people in your community. That's what matters. And in that lens, reading Harry Potter, that might, I don't know, that whole series, I'm not a huge fan. I've only read like half the books, but I've watched all the movies because, the women in my life have made me. But it's undeniable that reading Harry Potter or the Lord of the Rings, like the values that are in those actual books are all about community and caring for one another and self-sacrifice and all these really important things that, in my opinion, make the reader a better person. It doesn't really matter if the author, like if you didn't know already why the author was problematic, it wouldn't make you a worse person for having consumed that media. Right? So what really impacts people, what really impacts the world is how the media affects you personally and how you behave, right? Because you internalize ideas. If you read, the original Starship Troopers and you think militarism and fascism is great, the $10 you paid for that book matters a lot less than how you then go out and act in the world because you've internalized those ideas. That's what's important. Now, I have this 16, 17 minute rant now because like that's what I've finally been able to put my finger on it, that like there's this amalgamation of kind of sayings that like, oh, there's no such thing as ethical consumption and capitalism, right? Like, okay, yeah, you don't apply the same scrutiny when you use DoorDash probably, right? Even though maybe you should, because again, you're trained to think of yourself as a consumer first and media feels optional. So like that's where you can make a difference. It's not. That's just your social conditioning, and it's hard to shake. I get it. But what matters is how you actually behave in society. And when you're cutting yourself off from books and media that can actually help you understand society better and your role in it, you're not really helping anybody. All you're doing is denying J.K. Rowling, I don't know, another couple $100. I don't think she's going to notice, guys. So anyway, that's kind of the gist. That's my thesis. And anyway, at any rate, I did promise that I would have like, a final, like at the end here, I have a solution to this conundrum. If you really don't want to, contribute, especially to somebody who's like still alive that you think is problematic, like say J.K. Rowling, if you don't want to contribute to her vast wealth, I get it. There is a solution to this where you can avail yourself to these ideas, and not, contribute to her estate. And those are used bookstores and libraries. Two of the greatest things in this world. Just don't buy from Amazon. Go to the library. It's free. J.K. Rowling gets no money from you. That's it. Have a good one.